In this segment, we're going to talk about the need for management innovation, the need to fundamentally rethink our understanding about why management works the way it does and what it could do differently. And this is important, as I said in the previous segment, because the demands on the business world are changing faster than our traditional kind of capacity to change. And what we need to do to overcome that is to actually broaden our own concept of what innovation means. So we want to move from a thought that innovation is about new products and services towards a thought that, if you like, innovation is about new ways of working. And if you think about it, that's just an extension of the classical way of thinking about innovation. Innovation is the exploitation of new ideas. It can be a new idea for a widget, it can be a new idea for an iPhone, or it can be a new idea for a budgeting system. There's no reason why we can't innovate the budgeting system in the way that we can also innovate the products and services that we sell. So this segment is going to give you a few thoughts on what management innovation looks like in practice. The first way of doing this is I'm going to give you a historical example, and then I'm going to move to the present day. The historical example is the car industry. Think back over the last 100 years of the evolution of the car industry. And we can see, roughly speaking, 3 generations of leaders. The first generation of leadership was really Ford Motor Company. I mean, they weren't the pioneers of the motor car. I think that was Mercedes, Daimler-Benz. But Ford was the company that first popularized the car. How did they do that? They created a Model T Ford, a car that people could afford. How did they make a car that people could afford? They did it by essentially innovating the assembly line. And if you think about it, really, Ford's biggest innovation was not the Model T itself. It was the assembly line that dramatically reduced the costs of manufacturing cars so that everyday people could afford to buy them. They really democratized the car. Where did Henry Ford come up with the idea for the assembly line? Well, there's an interesting side story there, which I'm not going to go into any detail. Suffice it to say, he got the idea from the slaughterhouse, the abattoir, the disassembly line, if you like, where they were actually killing animals and chopping them up for human consumption. He got the idea from there. He turned it into a process innovation, a way for dramatically reducing the cost of manufacturing cars, and that put Ford into a prominent place. In the 1930s, the big change was that General Motors took over the leadership of the car industry, thanks to a gentleman pictured here, Alfred P. Sloan. He was the chief executive behind General Motors. And really, from that period in the 30s all the way through to the 1970s, even the 1980s, General Motors was the biggest car company in the world. What was Alfred Sloan's innovation? Well, again, it wasn't a specific car. What it was an innovation in the organizational structure of the company. In the academic world, we call this the M form, the multi-divisional form. Most of you will know it as this idea that companies have strategic business units. They have specific units, each of which focuses on one particular market. Now, that's commonplace today. Pretty much every company has a multi-divisional structure. But of course, that idea had to come from somewhere. And it basically came from not just Sloan, but Sloan and a couple of other companies in that period in the 30s. And what Sloan realized was that by creating 5 separate divisions for General Motors, Buick, Oldsmobile, Cadillac, Chevrolet, and so forth, he would be able to create a company which tapped into many more different segments of the market than Ford, who had a much more narrow focus. And of course, he kept central control, he kept control of the money, but he decentralized decision-making on individual business areas to his various lieutenants around the company. So Ford's innovation was the assembly line. General Motors' innovation was the multi-divisional structure. Move the clock forward to the present day, or really, I guess, the 1980s is when this started. Toyota became the leader of the car industry in the 1980s. What was Toyota's innovation? It was essentially, and we all know the terminology here, it was essentially the creation of what we nowadays call lean production or just-in-time manufacturing, sometimes even called the Toyota production system. And the idea there at its heart was they were trying to build quality into the products that they were selling, and they realized that to do that, you didn't want a separate department off to one side. What you needed was to get the workers on the line to take responsibility for quality. So they didn't just treat their workers on the line as automatons, they treated them as human beings with the ability and the judgment to stop the line, to identify problems, and then to use their training in statistical process control in order to help to figure out how to improve things. So one way of saying it is that Toyota reckoned that they could get a return on investing in the problem-solving skills of their employees. And that was a very different principle to the principle that General Motors and Ford and Volkswagen had used up till that point. So their innovation was in quality management, which was about changing the basis of relationship between the line workers and the managers. So there you have it, one industry, three eras. In each era, leadership comes down to innovations in the management principles and practices of the company rather than any particular product or service. So the argument is really that it is possible for a company to invest in management innovation and to develop sustainable competitive advantage as a result of that.